We will have the conversations that few are prepared to have, and more importantly, conversations centered on rationality. Subscribe now to listen to Rational Voices with Sunil. Lisa, amazing to have you on the show today. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. I'm doing good. I was reading the book summary you sent across to me, and it was so fascinating. Before we dive into the book and all the stuff you've done around it, it'd be great to get a brief overview of who you are.
Thank you. I'm happy to start with that. I was well, right now I'm a farmer and an author. Up until about 2020 March, the end of March of 2020, I was a Democratic advocate and lobbyist in Washington, D.C. in the United States. I came to Washington, D.C. straight out of a master's in social work program. I was recruited to work in the federal government by a program called the Presidential Management Internship Program, designed to draw people with graduate level education into federal service, created by Jimmy Carter in the 1970s. And I came to DC to do that at the very tail end of the Clinton administration and went to work for a federal agency there directly for an appointee of Bill Clinton to the Social Security Administration. I spent the next 20 years working primarily on disability policy, trying to help make federal policy here in the States more supportive of people with disabilities. And I focused on employment, income support, including Social Security, healthcare, and disability rights. And then throughout those 20 years, I kind of saw DC from every angle you might think of to be able to see it. I worked in the United States Senate for a couple of different United States senators, ones that we might have called liberal lions back in the day, Ted Kennedy and Tom Harkin of Iowa. I did also work for a short time in there for a Republican named Jim Jeffords, who is not very as well known, I would think, but in 2001 he kind of, when I was working for him, got in the spotlight because he left the Republican Party, became an independent, and gave control of the Senate to the Democrats right after 9/11 happened here in the U.S. And the reason I worked for him was that he was sort of one of the disability champions in the Senate. So disability is an issue that, at least in the past, used to really, disability policy used to be somewhat of a bipartisan issue, even if some of the solutions differed. Everyone could agree to want to be supportive of people with disabilities. So I worked there for a while. And then I also had my own consulting business in which I worked, was a consultant to nonprofits, also consultant to government contractors working on the implementation of federal programs, and then also worked directly for contractors and nonprofits. And in the middle of all of that, I went and took a break and went to law school full time while still working. So I got to see DC from pretty much every aspect you can. Towards the end of my career, I worked. The nonprofit I worked for had a small political action committee, which it was an association of members. Those members donated to the political action committee, and then we donated on their behalf to candidates. So I also got to see the way the money part of the policy making works as well. And then I decided to retire at the end of March of 2020, which, as you may remember, was right around when we were just ending our 2 weeks to flatten the curve, when the world changed forever at that point. And so the reason why I had set up my retirement at that time is that I had really seen Washington change over the 20 years that I was there, from a place where I think people agreed to disagree more, and they sort of would come into meetings with the idea that we're not going to agree on everything, but we want to work in a good faith effort to come up with a compromise that might benefit the American people. And no one would be super happy when we left the room, but everyone would think they got something that was beneficial for the country. And that really, really changed over the 20 years that I was there. Senators in the United States Senate used to eat dinner together across party lines. They used to um,
Wow.
socialize with each other. And they also, Senator Jeffords, who I mentioned previously, was in a cappella singing group with Democrat and Republican members of the Senate. And so there was just a lot more of we see each other as human and we disagree about some things, but we're here to serve the American people. And by the time I retired, everything was about how is this going to look at election time and what does this mean for the party, and you better step in line to the party. Um, and so that was a real change. And I stopped seeing myself as being able to make a positive difference. And so I had made that decision to retire even before the COVID pandemic hit and the lockdowns came, and some of the things that happened then, which really opened my eyes to a lot of other things that were going on in my
Right.
country and also the world. So.
I mean, it's fascinating. It seems like you have so much experience in DC. I mean, to before we go into the book, what were some of the things that really surprised you in DC? We don't hear a lot in terms of most of our listeners are from the UK. We don't hear often a lot of what goes on behind the scenes in DC. What are some of the things that we wouldn't be aware of that happens, and what were some things that really surprised you?
So I think one of the things that maybe you do know, and I will admit I don't know exactly how things behind the scenes work over there. So across the pond from us. So this may not be as surprising, but by 2024, last year, $4.6 billion was spent on lobbying. And that's with a B, and that's a lot of money. And that's a billion more than was spent in 2015. And so what I think was somewhat surprising is what does that actually mean in terms of how does it get spent and what does that mean for the people who spend it? And, a lot of the ways that it gets spent is that, a member of Congress will hold a lunch or a dinner fundraiser, and these lobbyists will pay $1,000 to sit down and eat dinner with them. And when they do that, and it can be 1,000 or more, up to the limit that is 5,000 in a non-election or year, 5,000 for each election, so the primary and the general election in an election year. And that doesn't mean a quid pro quo. That doesn't mean if I give you $1,000, I get my bill or I get my thing in the bill that I'm looking for. But what it does is it provides access and it provides an opportunity to create a relationship that legislators' constituents would have a lot of trouble matching. These are generally relatively small, 10 to maybe 20 people in a room with a congressman or a senator. And there is one staff member here in the US. If you work in the Congress for a legislator, you are not supposed to be involved in the political aspect of it. So you're either a policy person or you're an elections and political person. But there is one position on the Hill that can go back and forth between the two, and that's the chief of staff. And they generally attend all of those meetings or all of those fundraisers. So you get to have a good relationship with the chief of staff. You have their phone number. When you call, it's very likely that you will get a meeting, and that type of access does improve your chances, obviously, of getting your legislative goal accomplished. And so when you think about that, that's an enormous amount of money. Now, that is separate from the almost $20 billion that was spent through political action committees and other donations on the election itself in 2024. So, I think that in the US, a lot of people have felt as though those in Washington who are supposed to be representing us are becoming less and less accountable and less representative of what we want, and much more representative of what the oligarchs and the moneyed interests want. And I think if you just look at that piece of it, it is probably pretty clear that's one reason why. And beyond these lunch and dinner fundraisers, they will also do weekend retreats. And So you can go and spend, at this point, usually those are at least $5,000, and you get to spend the weekend with a number of legislators and create more of that relationship. And, it can be extremely hard as a constituent, as a voter, to get any time in front of your actual senator or congressman, let alone a whole weekend eating dinner with them. And, some of them are wine weekends in Napa Valley, and you go around and tour wineries and drink, glasses of lovely wine and other things like that. And so I think that was one thing that I don't know that it necessarily surprised me as much as I'm not sure that a lot of people understand that that's sort of how it works. I think there's a perception that if you spend money, you get what you want, and it makes it much more likely that you're going to get what you want. But I also think you could, if you had the money for your pack, eat every day, lunch and dinner with members of Congress. And, that is something that I think it would be kind of surprising to people.
Is the power of the lobbies and power of these people having access to senators, was that part of the reason you decided to do this book? Was that part of the rationale behind your book?
Um, I think it was a little bit. I think part of what happened after a lot of what caused me to wake up was what happened during COVID. And part of once I woke up to the truth about the party that I had supported my entire life and what was really going on there, I really was trying to figure out how did this change so much during the time that I was in DC, and what does that mean as we move forward, as we try. I think it's really important that we figure out how we can reclaim our power as voters. And it became really clear to me that one of the things that really stands in the way is all that money. I'll relate another story to you that I think can sort of explain why I think that's the case as well, Sunil, is that um, so if you support someone as they're running for election and then they win, they often will have a little thank you breakfast or dinner for you to say thank you to all the people who supported my campaign. And I remember going to one, it was a breakfast, and it was 3 days into the new term for a brand new member of Congress. She's from a Midwestern state. She was really happy to be there. And we asked her a couple of, really just sort of what's your favorite thing so far about being, as a member of Congress. And then we asked her, and I don't, sadly, I don't remember what she said about that, but I do remember the next question that got asked, what's your least favorite thing? And she looked around and she kind of said, well, my fundraiser's going to kill me, but the worst part is call time. And what she meant by that is that her fundraising staff would hand her a sheet of donors, and she needed to call them, and she would have to sit and call them to raise money. And this was 3 days into her brand new term. And so the pressure on our members of Congress to raise money when you're looking at an election cycle with almost $20 billion being spent in it, they're expected to raise money for their own campaign. They are also expected to raise money for the leadership, and they're expected to raise money for the committees. And so they don't even get a minute to, get their feet on the ground practically before they're already raising money. And so if we're in the US, at least, if we're looking at how can we restore our power as voters so that we don't see Congress continually passing things that seemingly nobody in the country actually supports. Um, I think we have to figure out how we address the power of money and the power of lobbying um, in our country.
Fascinating because how does a member of Congress or the Senate, how do they govern, or how do their job if they're always worried about fundraising, the election cycles? It must be so hard for them to then actually do the job that they're elected for, well, for the people that they're elected for. It must be very difficult if even after 3 days winning an election, you're already thinking about raising more money for the next one and all this sort of thing. It must be very difficult to yeah, effectively do your job.
I think that's a fair point, and I think another thing maybe that would be surprising to people is how much members of Congress really rely on their staff to help them do that part of the job. So, their days often can be scheduled from 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. with everything, including bathroom breaks, scheduled and broken down in 10-minute increments for them, and that's what their scheduling staff does. And then, they will have, let's say they have a committee meeting that they're going to. Their staff will have prepared, they will have read all the materials and prepared a memo for them. And so they will do their best to read all the materials themselves, but often, obviously, because of these scheduling issues, they can't do it themselves. So they rely on their staff, and the staff gives them the memo. And often they have what they call a basket or a bag that is left for staff to, and this was back, I'm sure now with electronic communication it may not be the same, but all of my senators wanted stuff in paper, and so you would print it out and it needed to go in the basket before the end of their scheduled day so that they could review it overnight, and when they came back in the morning they would be ready for the meeting. And oftentimes you would get, oh, the senator has a question about your memo. Can you be here? I would often, there are in the US, there are underground trains that members of Congress take back and forth to the Capitol from their office buildings. And there were many times when you would be running next to the senator while they were headed to the floor, and you would be briefing them on the memo you wrote last night while you're running under to catch the train and then taking the train over. So it does make it challenging. And I would say, especially in the House of Representatives, because those are 2-year terms. The Senate, it's a little bit more laid back because those are 6-year terms. So they might not be fundraising as quickly in the Senate, but those also, because they are only 6-year terms and you're representing a whole state in the US, those tend to be much more expensive races as well. So they have a little bit less time pressure, but they may need to raise quite a bit more money over those 6 years than would a member of the House.
Interesting. I think it'd be really probably a good time to talk about your book. So I read the first few chapters that you sent across and a summary. And it's really, really fascinating, and it's something that I think it's great to get these insights from somebody who's got so much experience in DC. Um, for people who are unaware of your book, it'd be great to get a brief summary of what it is and how you came to the decision to write this book.
Sure, thank you. So my book is called Deprogramming Democrats and Educating the Elites: How I Escaped the Progressive Cult. And I was a lifelong Democrat. I used to say I bled blue, and I would vote blue no matter who. And I really saw, you know, but I was an old school Democrat. I was sort of a JFK Democrat, and I can explain, a little bit about what I mean by that. My parents raised me to believe in America, to be patriotic, to love my country, and to um, understand that we have here in America, in our First Amendment and our Second Amendment, our Bill of Rights, really something that is very unique in the history of the world. Our natural born, God given rights enshrined in these amendments that say the government shall not infringe upon your ability to speak freely, your ability to associate freely, your ability to protest your government when you think your government is wrong, and your ability to worship when and where you please. And so I was raised up with a real respect for the Constitution and almost a feeling of obligation to, as a responsible citizen, hold my government to account when I felt they were abusing power. And so that was sort of in the background of who I was. And my parents raised me to be a free speech absolutist. Really, I remember them. I remember finding out that the American Civil Liberties Union, which I used to be a card-carrying member of and support, and now I don't, although they still do some good work. They've been on the wrong side, in my opinion, of some issues around free speech, and I can talk about that. But they actually represented in the early 1970s some members of the Nazi Party to march in Skokie, Illinois, and have a parade. And I was aghast at that, and my parents explained to me. I was a young girl. I was in junior high, I think, middle school, when I guess grade 7. That might help explain it. I don't know exactly what you call it over there, but yeah, I said, well, why in the world would the ACLU do that? That's awful. And they really explained to me that the way free speech works is you don't get to control who gets to talk. And if their right to speak isn't free, then neither is yours. And so that really stuck with me. And the amendments in our Constitution are not there for the easy times. They're there for the hard times. They're there for the times when conversations need to happen to hold power to account. They're there for when we have strong disagreements so that we can resolve them, hopefully with no violence and with no civil upset to our republic. And so that really stuck with me. And I began to see changes in the Democratic Party that were not consistent with those long-standing beliefs that I held. And I think that it really all started with political correctness in our country, where probably 70s, 80s it started, really kind of picked up steam in the 90s, but then really got out of control after the turn of the 21st century, where, people started policing your language. And, when it first started, if you used a word or a term that was no longer in favor, people would just say, oh, you're not being very nice. Maybe you don't want to use that term because that will hurt someone's feelings. And it got to the point that people were starting to get canceled. People were starting to get deplatformed. And, I think I may be, in some ways, when I'm talking about this, preaching to the choir over there, so to speak, because obviously you're having some real attacks on free speech. People are going to prison
Definitely.
for memes and things like that. So, but I started to see this happening here. And I found it to be very inconsistent with our First Amendment protections. And I found that, I also went back and looked at where did the term political correctness came from. And this is when I was writing the book. I looked at it, and it was actually like straight out of Mao's communist China, in terms of right speak. And it's also comes straight out of George Orwell's 1984. And so neither of those are sides that I wanted to be on. So I started to see that and began, especially around 2016 or so, started to become uncomfortable. It got to the point where, for example, if you believe that there are two genders or two sexes and two genders, man and woman, and you want to speak that way because you believe it, half of the people in the Democratic Party in a poll in 2022 said that should be a crime. Okay. And this doesn't sit well. Yeah. Half the people in the Democratic Party in a survey said you should go to jail for that. And that raised some alarm bells for me. But, I think I had become so, as I mentioned, I have a master's in social work and a law degree. And so that meant I had spent a lot of time in school, in my adult life. And, in the US, being in school is a bit of an indoctrination process as opposed to a real education process. You do not get awards for asking questions. You do not get awards for making a professor or a teacher questioning their authority or saying that they're wrong. In fact, what you get, high grades and picked for programs like I did, the Presidential Management Intern Program, you get that for going along with authority, being a good student, doing your work but not causing any trouble. And asking questions and critically thinking about the ideas, the basic fundamental philosophical ideas that you're being taught, you do not get rewarded for that. You actually get punished. And in the US, I heard people, conservatives and Republicans all the time talking about how schools are liberal indoctrination centers. And I thought that's just not true. Facts just happen to have a liberal bias, but now if you look at it, over 90% of professors at university are Democrats, and 95% of their donations go to Democratic candidates. And so when you have that type of bias, and that's going to differ depending on what you're studying. If you are in, I think some of the harder sciences, those percentages are going to be a little bit different. But what you would consider the softer humanities, sociology, and the places I found myself, my professors were almost exclusively on the left. And so I got indoctrinated to believe that the left was morally superior to the right, that that collectivism is better than a society based on individual liberties, and that government is almost always the answer. And so with my work, that just kept happening more. And so I was, like I said, vote blue no matter who, and really thought that giving government more power was the way that we could reach equality and that we could have a better society. And that a lot of the way in which I was, programmed was using fear. So after September 11th, here in our country, we were convinced to give up a lot of rights in order to be kept safe. And these were all the kinds of ways. So when you look at the Patriot Act, we have in our Constitution, our Bill of Rights, the Fourth Amendment, which protects us from unreasonable searches and seizures and requires the government to have a warrant to search you. Well, the Patriot Act changed that. That's what Edward Snowden brought out, and they were in fact spying on all of us without a warrant. And I use this as an example because I think it's a perfect one of slowly conditioning people to give up their rights, and that is the Transportation Security Administration. We get searched without a warrant every time we go to the airport and travel. Now, you can make all sorts of arguments about whether that is necessary. I don't think it's necessary to take your shoes off. And I think that it is ludicrous to think that 3.1 ounces of a particular liquid you could make a bomb, and 2.9 ounces of that same particular liquid you could not. So these are things that we agreed to do in order to feel safe again. And this is a way that the two strategies are sort of divide and conquer us, get us fighting with each other, and keep us afraid of the enemy. So all of these things started, rolling around in my mind. And it was when COVID hit and we started to see all of a sudden our fundamental rights under the First Amendment gone without even a conversation. You can't speak freely. It's disinformation to question the prevailing narrative about the pandemic. You cannot associate with who you want to. You can't go to your parents for Thanksgiving, but thousands of people can get together to protest, provided it's the right cause. And you can't assemble, and and they were shutting down places of worship as well. So all of the First Amendment rights gone without so much as a discussion, people being censored. I had done a fair bit of research when my parents became ill around what actually works to keep people healthy. And so I also saw that a lot of the things that they were recommending at that time really didn't make any sense. At the very beginning of COVID, they were telling us we couldn't leave our houses, right? We couldn't even go into our yard, our garden, even if we had a private one that no one else could get into. And what is the most important thing to keep you healthy? One of them, vitamin D, right? And so you can't go
Yep.
outside, sit in the sun, you can't breathe fresh air. And this made no sense. So this makes no sense. They're censoring everybody. So this can't be the right, something is wrong. And my partner, who was my boyfriend at the time, asked me a question that really shocked my brain into working again. What I said to him, with all these recommendations, with all the censorship, I just can't believe the people I've worked with all these years, that I've trusted, these agencies, are doing this to us, to the world, without data and evidence. And he said, if they'll poison our water, what won't they do? And here in the US, they put fluoride in our water. Nowhere else, pretty much, in the world do they do this. And I already knew it to be the case that it does affect IQ in children. It's not good for us. So I knew they're poisoning our water, and it's the thing we need most to keep us alive. And so that question caused my brain to break and my reality to crumble,
Yep.
and me to start asking about everything I always believed to be true. And it took me a couple of years, Neil, to sort of put myself back together. And when I did, and recognizing the danger that I saw to the country that I loved, I asked myself, what can I do to try to help protect the country, to save the country? And that is where the idea for the book came from, to share my story so that maybe it can help wake
Yeah.
other people up.
I think that your COVID story there will relate to so many people listening into this podcast. We've done quite an extensive amount on COVID here, with people from Britain, Australia, US as well on here. And one of the things we've talked about quite a lot on this show is, I think, the really sad, disappointing thing for me when it comes to lockdowns in particular, and just various other things that happened in the UK and globally, was the lack of protest or the lack of engagement, the lack of debate. It was really, I always had this presumption, clearly wrong presumption, that if you said to me 5, 6 years ago, you know, regardless of a left government or right government being in power, there's no way the people of Britain would allow their leader to say, you're going to stay at home and there's no debate about it. You cannot leave your homes. You're going to give up your civil liberties, and we're not going to have no discussions about it. I would have, if you asked me 5, maybe 10 years ago, I would have said there's no way the average Brit would put up with that. They would not accept that. And what was quite sad is, in Britain we did accept it, to the point in which you had neighbours reporting the police that there's too many people come to a house, or like, a mother has gone to see her child that she hasn't seen in years or whatever. They would report it to the police. There was examples of people getting arrested at park benches because they were too close together. This is something that I would never have assumed. And it's, in particular, what was really scary was it was a conservative government. I always was led to believe, in terms of small governments and all this sort of stuff, don't give state power, but it was the same people who talk about that were then exerting really high level of governance. And I think it was really, really disturbing in the UK. So it's fascinating to listen to yourself talk about how even 9/11 and all of that stuff. And I'm sure there was way more things than just COVID that accelerated this process. But going to that point, was COVID the big breaking point for where you thought you had to do a book? Was there anything else in build up towards COVID where you saw signs of this sort of behavior happening?
Yeah, I think in the US, the rise of, I think there's two main ways that those who want to take power try to control the people. One is fear, and the other is dividing us from each other and causing us to fight, so that we are not paying attention to what they're doing. And I was disappointed too. We had no conversation. Everything's just closed, and the big, Walmarts here in the US can stay open, but mom and pop shop has to close down, and all of that, and without a conversation of, does that really make any sense? And so fear they've been using that, and since 9/11, and also here in the United States with identity politics. And I think that what I started to see in terms of the division between any way they could divide us, men versus women, it's toxic masculinity, it's men want to take away your reproductive rights, it's black versus white. And, I think we had been coming to a much better place around race until President Obama came in. And then we started to see really divisive language around a race. And then we started to see the rise of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And what that was designed to do and tear us apart from each other. And then beyond men versus women, we started to see the gender ideology thing going on. And, I had started to see a lot of people putting their pronouns in their, email signature and things like that. And then we started to see all that kind of stuff. And, when you talk about, for example, the gender ideology, there was a concerted effort to make trans people believe there's a trans genocide going on. So they have to protect themselves because we're trying to all kill them all. Um, and so that again is fear. Identity politics at its base is division and it's fear. And it's the same thing that happened with, women trying to make their vote come down to one issue. And for a lot of young women, it does. And that is abortion. And, terrifying. Like, I think we might want to, as a society and maybe culture more broadly, take a step back and ask ourselves, why is such a fundamental biological process that is actually, in my opinion, a gift from nature or the creator, whichever way you look at that, of reproduction, so scary that you will vote on it, and it makes you so afraid that you're willing to accept all these other policies that are not in your interest in order to maintain that one particular thing. But I was seeing this fear-based manipulation and control and divide and conquer even before I woke up. But I think by the time we got to COVID, fear was it. It was all fear. It was turn on your television and all you see is a counter. How many deaths, how many tests, how many positive, and then anywhere you went, online. And so I think fear as a way to control people cannot be underestimated.
I mean, the death counter was just something crazy in the UK. We used to get the Prime Minister briefing on some weeks every single day, and it would be him and the head of NHS England, and there'd be three of them, and they would every day would talk about the amount of people who have died. And I think what the interesting thing is, the big awakening for me with COVID was May 2020, because in the UK that was the month with the lowest recorded amount of cancer patients diagnosed. And I remember saying that this is absolutely terrible. Cancer hasn't stopped, but people were so scared to go to the GP if they even coughed a bit of blood and maybe they're showing stage one signs, because they were so scared of a virus that's more than 99% chance of survival. They would not go to see their local doctor, their local GP, so they would suffer at home. And by the time they did, unfortunately for a lot of them, they ended up actually dying. And I think that was really, for me, where I really was disturbed by what I could clearly see was starting to happen. And it's funny you talk about abortion, because right now in the UK, the UK is going through a current abortion bill, which is legislative to the fact that abortion can happen up until birth. So previously it was around 22 weeks, and now an amendment's been put in so that it goes all the way up to birth. And it just seems like I wouldn't say I'm particularly on either side for this, but it just seems like it's getting more and more, well, crazy. I mean, you've worked with the Democratic Party for long periods of your life. Where and how has this changed so much? Because I listened to some speeches from Bill Clinton and people previously, and to me, there's no way these people, or that version of them anyway, could be Democrats now. I'd feel like they would get vilified, and even some of the things I've heard Obama say, I don't think he wouldn't dare to say them. Why has that changed so much?
So I think it's a number of things. I think that you have you seen the little meme where there's the frog sitting in the pot of water, and then they slowly turn the heat up, so then the water's boiling and the frog doesn't notice. It was really incremental. It was sort of the policy positions changed a little bit over time. And so, yeah, abortion is a perfect example of that. People, Democrats used to say it should be safe, legal, and rare. Let's try to prevent it, but let's make sure it's available in the instance where it is needed. And slowly over time, again, it's using fear. And again, I think we should take a step back and ask, why is the idea of becoming pregnant so scary to women that, and I will say that that sort of feminist programming worked on me. I chose not to have any children of my own. And so, it was the idea that, you know, um, I need to provide for myself, and if I have a baby, I will not be able to provide for myself. And that whole idea going along with, I can't rely on a man. And men are toxic and all of the things. I don't know if you saw this on social media, but the whole thing where women said, would you rather be lost in the woods with a man or a bear? And a lot of the women were choosing the bear.
Yeah,
Yeah, that whole thing. So I think a lot of this was sort of that cultural change. But what they did is it slowly seemed to keep pushing the positions on the left further and further to the left, until it became very radicalized. And I think that the advent of technology and social media and the 24-hour news cycle and the soundbite all played into this, Sunil, because um, people became very dependent on their online communities for their socialization. And so if you express an opinion online, if you're a Democrat and you don't, I call it sort of the need for ideological conformity. You have to believe exactly as we do, or you're morally bad, and we're going to cancel you. We're going to excommunicate you out of the group. Um, and I think COVID really drove this even further, because all of us could only communicate and socialize through online means for a number of years, and so we get into these echo chambers and we keep hearing these messages over and over again, and they keep pushing the positions further and further to the left until you do get these positions of, you know, and I would ask a question like, okay, so one day before birth, what's the difference morally between that baby and one day after birth? Because you can't fall back on what a lot of women would say, well, the baby can't survive on its own. Well, one day before birth, it absolutely can. A month before birth, it absolutely can. And so, but if, I even if I hadn't woken up and um, left the party on my own, I think I would have my party card removed for having even this conversation with you. And the consequences of that these days are pretty severe. I mean, people get canceled and deplatformed, and more and more people are moving to where they do rely on their ability to be online, in order to make their living. And so the idea of them being deplatformed, could really significantly impact them in a different way. And um, I also think that, I it's not clear to me what percentage of the people I run into on social media are real people, actually, even, or how many of them are these bots that are parroting the same thing over and over again. And a big part of repetition or of indoctrination is repetition and programming and brainwashing. All of those tech use the technique of repetition over and over again to get someone to believe something. And I think that online has made the social media and the other internet, the fact that has made that even worse. And I think it was just incrementally, slowly, we kept moving to the left, and nobody noticed. And then all of a sudden, here we are, about in the United States to elect an avowedly socialist mayor in one of our largest cities, and that's where we find ourselves. And so I think that also, I think it was a little sad to me too in the US when we really didn't, we had huge George Floyd protests, but we didn't have lockdown protests, that in the
Yeah.
same way. And but I think the other thing that's become really clear to me is that the economic situation for your average American, and this may be the same in the UK as well, I don't know, is really quite dire in terms of the fact that so many
Yeah.
people are in huge debt, and they can't afford to risk losing the job that they have, because we have, I think, 6 or 7 out of 10 people live paycheck to paycheck. So the idea of protest is actually quite scary, because if you protest and they decide they're going to arrest you, that might mean your family's out on the street. And we also have uh, a lot of people are single parents, and so you can't risk protesting. You're just trying to keep the lights on and food on the table and make sure your kids get to school on time. And so that doesn't excuse the lack of protest, but I think it explains it. And it again is another way in which fear of economic consequences for speaking up, I think, have also been used to control people. So.
Going to your book, the chapter on why this has worked on the left in particular with the control and all this sort of stuff. I'm fascinated to get more insights from yourself on why it has particularly worked on the left. I mean, there's so many issues that are now discussed that I would again never have seen as left or right. The gender one's an example that there's so many I can think of which I never associate with politically. I would have just presumed Democrats, Republicans, Conservatives, Labour in UK. We're all on the kind of similarish page, same page. But now it seems absolutely everything is politicized. Why has that? Why has this particularly worked on the left in terms of the control aspect and all that? And to be fair, again, a lot of UK listeners would argue it's also worked on the right. We've had a more right-leaning, allegedly more right-leaning government in power for a long period of time, and a lot of these powers were taken away from us. Lots of freedom of speech is very bad right now in the UK, but it's been happening for a while. It's now got a lot more attention because Elon Musk and other people, but it has been happening for a long time. But yeah, in particular the US, why has this worked on the left?
So I will say that, I think that there are definitely brainwashed people on the right in the US as well. There are people on both sides, but can only really speak to the left because that's my experience. And why I think it has worked on people on the left in the US is a couple of things. The first one is that um, a lot of the people on the left do not have any religious or spiritual faith, and so they don't have a connection to the creator. And there are certain things I think you get when you have that help protect you against this type of indoctrination from the government. One of that is that you feel accepted, you feel loved, you feel like um, that God has your back, and so it's a lot harder to control you through fear. You also have that acceptance, so you aren't looking necessarily for external validation from other humans in the same way if you lack that. And so the whole sort of groupthink and the willingness to conform ideologically is a lot less evident when someone is a religious. Um, if you are religious, and I personally, I have my faith, but I don't practice a religion. I don't go to church or a synagogue or anything like that. But I have my own relationship with the Creator, and and I developed this since I woke up. So these are things that I saw in myself. And it becomes a lot easier when you do have that faith to be willing to take a stand. And when you're being pushed by the social pressure of your community, in this case, the left, no, 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 we really need to have open borders. You're racist if everybody doesn't get to come in. It's a lot harder to stand up and say no. That's not true. I'm not racist. I want to have a rational conversation about at what point, is this a problem? And I think that that's a big part of it. I think that one of the other things that happened on the left, you'll hear people in the US on the left, oh, we're the educated people. They're the uneducated, ignorant people. And education shuts down your desire to ask questions and critically think. So you buy what the experts are saying way more than someone maybe who didn't spend years being told, don't question authority, don't question authority, do what teacher says, do what the professor says, so you can get a good grade.
That's amazing. That's amazing, but because it's funny because we're on the podcast earlier. Funny enough, today we didn't go quite in this level of detail, but we were talking about how people who are it seems to be in the UK, by the sound of things, exact same in the US, where the very educated people, the so-called experts, got so many things wrong, and I was saying I just don't understand how people with degrees, with masters, all this stuff, very highly educated people keep still going back to those people for trust. If you've made some really wrong decisions in anything, in any specialist field, you're just not going to accept it anymore, surely. But it seems I'm so surprised at the amount of people with some people I consider very, very intelligent, very, very book smart, but they just cannot critically think about questioning a so-called expert. So it's very well put.
Yeah, and so when I call the left in the US a cult, the progressive part of it, sometimes I get pushback. Well, there's no charismatic leader, and I said, well, you're looking at it wrong. They worship authority and they idolize the expert. And it is like a faith. It's scientism, instead of science. It is you believe in what the expert says, and it is the logical fallacy of appeal to authority. And it is also, part of it is that so many of us on the left, we had our degrees too. And so we were told because we had our degrees and the credentials, we were experts. So if we undermine their authority based on their expertise, we're also undermining ourselves. And so when you start to call them into question, then you have to call yourself into question. And a lot of people don't like to do that. I think the final point that I will say on the left is that that left people open to this kind of manipulation is that I find that they have failed to articulate to themselves the principles which all of their beliefs and positions come from. And some of this comes back to the lack of faith, because if you are religious, there are a lot of principles that usually come with your religion to help guide you about things. But I think also some of it comes from the not questioning not questioning the teacher and not questioning your own beliefs and where do they come from and how do I. So and that's why I think you saw a lot of ends justifying the means, like people willing to turn someone else in. Is that really what you want someone to do to you? So what principle are you operating on when you're doing that? but I also think what I've noticed on the left is those lack of principles often lead people to be able to hold a great deal of cognitive dissonance, meaning they can hold ideas um, that really don't fit together, that can't both possibly be true, but because of their faith in experts, if two experts told them these things, then they must both be true, even if they can't both be true, and I'm going to hold them there. And what the question about the water that my boyfriend at the time asked me um, pushed my cognitive dissonance so far I couldn't maintain it anymore. But the lack of principle and this unwavering belief in experts, I think, is a big part of what led people on the left here in the States to be able to be brainwashed and indoctrinated, Neil.
I suppose my you've got a chapter where you talk about how to stop the deprogramming, how to and change it. Before we go into that part, is why have why do you think that some of the left and for the UK also some of the right, why have they not fought back, or why after, like, especially after what happened with COVID and all these things, why has there not been the sense of we trusted these people, they completely got it wrong, we trusted so many different experts, it's happened so many times on so many different cases, and every single time it's not really worked, or there's been so many major mishaps. Why isn't there this kind of just not reconciliation, but this kind of questioning where you think to yourself, this like what like our discussion here. Why are not other people on the left doing it?
Well, I think part of it is, it's hard to explain, but you just really don't question the experts. And there's not critical thinking. There isn't that level of taking a step back. Um, I think there's also this sort of it's an elitism and a moral superiority. The people on my side are better and they're right. And so uh I think there's an unwillingness to question. I went on a podcast with someone who is still on the left, and we were having a COVID discussion, and he said, yeah, they made mistakes, but they were doing their best. And those a lot of us on the left just thought, well, we should err on the side of caution, we should be safe. And the way that I responded to him is to say that I get that and I can understand that. There are some things that were said that were just outright lies. They weren't mistakes. They knew that there
Yeah,
was never
definitely.
any immunity, from these shots, but yet they lied and said that there was. And that's one thing. But the other thing is that we can't ever give, I said to him, the businesses back to the people who lost them because we shut down and we didn't need to. We can't ever give these kids back those 2, 3 years of where they didn't get to go to school, or the young kids who are developmentally delayed because of masks and they couldn't, see anyone's face. And so we can't ever get those back. And my problem is exactly what you raise, is that we're not having any conversations to prevent it from happening again. And I think that part
Yeah.
of it is that, one of the subsections in my book, it talks about victimhood and accountability. And I think part of the reason they can't, Sunil, is because they would have to hold themselves accountable for the consequences of what happened when COVID happened, and they didn't speak up. And
Did you? I suppose going on to the accountability bit, I just want to ask you on this because it's something that I've been toying with quite a bit with the UK. So, like, there's lots of examples of the government's getting more and more involved. There's a new initiative that's come out today that's in the UK. The Prime Minister will be not the Prime Minister, his government will be enacting a policy where every single school will be able to provide breakfast for children going to school, and there's a massive debate going on now where it's like, well, is it the state's job to provide breakfast or is it not the parents' job? And I was in my head, I just keep having this same thing. which is it just feels like no one wants to take any accountability or responsibility, and we just want the state or whoever to solve it. Is that similar to the book saying, or
It is. It doesn't get down to that level. It's more so I just remember the full title of that section is Entitlement, Victimhood, and Accountability. And there is this sort of thing that has happened, I think, where people don't believe they believe they are entitled to other people's money for some reason, and that the government is, they're entitled to get benefits, and that they don't need to be accountable for their own behavior and their own decisions. And I this is something I think that is the other way that they sort of have controlled the left and have yeah, so they've controlled the left, and it's by using their compassion, like nobody wants to see a child go hungry, right? So it's a sort of like a pull on my heartstrings that, yeah, we should provide everyone with breakfast. Well, one of the things that I that has occurred for me, I moved out into the country, and I live on a farm now, and I've met a lot of people out here that a few dollars more in taxes a month would actually mean that they can't feed their own family. And I think a lot of the people who are supporting these policies also live in the luxury of having enough money that these extra taxes to help pay for breakfast may not negatively impact them in any way. So they're more than happy to spend your money to help somebody else as well. But I think there is a big piece about um, people no longer believing that they need to be responsible for their own well-being and their accountability. And the way I kind of put it here in the US is that our Constitution very clearly shows that we are a republic based on individual rights. And individual rights are inherently incompatible with a collectivist society. You cannot have both. You can either have individual rights, or you can have a society in which the collective is the important part. And we have to make a choice. And in a collective um, environment, be it socialism, communism, fascism, you the state gets to decide, and you give up your authority and also your responsibility to the state. And I think that is a large part of what we're facing, and it is for me it is quite concerning, because again, I firmly believe in individual rights, and I don't ever want any government, I don't care who it is in the government, um, being able to make such types of decisions about my own life. So I think that is a big part of it. It is a not wanting to be responsible for your choices and held accountable for them, and to get things that, quite frankly, maybe you haven't earned and you haven't worked
yeah?
to receive.
I mean, you've obviously had the experience of being in Washington for so long, and you've gone through this journey, and you've come to this point now where you're looking back and disagreeing with a lot of what's happened in the last few years and parts before. The last bit I read in the book was about deprogramming yourself. I think even what'd be interesting to get your take is how. So you're somebody who's listening to this podcast. You're somebody who still belongs to the left and still um, maybe doesn't necessarily maybe agrees with some of the issues in which you're saying, but doesn't necessarily think it's as serious as it is. We get this quite a lot on this podcast. I would say historically I still am definitely. I've always been more on the right, but it's ironic. I've had more people from the left, the historic left, I'd say the more old school left on this podcast than I've had than on the right. We've had so many people who were lifelong Labour supporters on here. It's a lot of it on some of the trans stuff, and just general debates like that where they've now essentially they're independent. I would probably best say. But how would you how would you get somebody on the left now to essentially understand that they are being programmed, that they are being made to get divided, and they are made to create the sort of it? How would you? Because naturally, if you're somebody on the left and you're hearing this, you won't probably want to hear a lot of this, and your natural reaction would be to be a bit defensive. So how would you say it to somebody, yeah, who is more on the left now to essentially listen to what you're saying?
So that's a good question, and I often say I wish I had a playbook. I wish I could just tell you this is how you do it, and it would work for everyone still. But I think the first thing is that it is going to be somewhat of an individualized conversation in most cases that will help someone wake up, sort of like the conversation I had with my boyfriend. And the first thing that I would say is that you really have to ask questions. You can't try to tell them. You have to ask them questions. And it does a couple of things. First, what it does is it validates them in a way that you care about what they have to say and what they have, what they think, which is an important part, as we talked about earlier, in what the characteristics of people on the left are that would leave them open to this. Part of why I chose to tell my story is that I hope that they might see somewhat of themselves in me. I did everything in that the left wanted me to do. I was a hardcore Democrat. I went to school. I worked for the party. I worked to get their candidates elected. I did all of that. And, I think asking them, to take a step back and think about what their fundamental principles are. Think about, you know, we had, which is kind of, maybe silly to you, we had the No Kings protests here in the US, which we literally do not have a king. We have a elected president who won the popular vote in our country, but that's a side note. But the reason I mention it is I saw a number of people going around and interviewing people at these protests about why are you here? What are you protesting? And invariably, they couldn't get below the sound bites. They couldn't get underneath the talking points to articulate what they actually felt and what those principles and reasons were for why they were there. And one of the things that you can do is in conversation with someone, ask them a question. Well, one of the things that I would ask people is, well, what does freedom actually mean to you? What does liberty mean to you? What does a right mean to you? Because they will often say, well, healthcare is a human right. And I want to step back and say, now wait a minute. How do you define healthcare in a way that makes it an inherent right? Um, so does that mean everybody is entitled to every health care? Does that mean, just sort of digging into that? Because to me, a right is something that you have that doesn't require anybody else to give it to you. Like basically with healthcare, it is someone else's labor in order to provide you with whatever healthcare service that is required. Now, how is that a right? And so
Yeah.
it's asking those kind of questions, and the other thing about the questions, if you want to really try to ask people, is that they can't presuppose an answer and they can't include facts that they might disagree with if an expert disagreed with them. Because at the basic level, what you're trying to get the person to do is be willing to ask questions again, to question the ideological conformity that's being required of them, to question how did I arrive at this position? And, another really good question is, did you think the same thing 10 years ago that you think today? And if not, why not?
Mm.
And again, this is not an easy process. It wasn't for me. If you talk to Jamie, my partner, he would tell you it wasn't an easy process for him either. We went through a lot of um, verbal sparring, and a lot of it's very, very hard when you realize that your brain has been captured um, by programming and you've been indoctrinated, and that you have not for a very long time been thinking for yourself. And So, like I said, I wish it was an easy answer. I wish that it was, but I think it can be done. If I could wake up with my bleeding blue credentials and background, I think most anybody could. The other thing is to know that if they react badly, if they start calling you a name or saying you're an ism or a phobia or all of those things, you've actually gotten through in some way, because they've reached the
Yep.
point where they can't go any further. So they're survival brain, their reptilian survival brain is lashing out to prevent them from having to try to think, because they know their reality is being threatened. So wear that as a badge of honor and don't take it personally. And know that you may have planted a seed in their mind that will then germinate. And then if enough seeds get planted, there will be a new garden that grows that may allow them to begin to think for themselves again.
Amazing. It's been amazing speaking to you, Lisa. It's been so informative, and I think so many of the listeners will learn so much from this. It's been amazing. We have a closing ritual we do on the show where I ask the guest for an unpopular opinion that you have that you think should be popular.
Um, in today's day and age, I think it is a unpopular opinion that it is okay to be patriotic and to love your country and to believe that borders are important in order to have a country. And I don't
That
think
will
it should
be
be at all questionable, but it is. So there you go.
I mean, if you say that in the UK now, you are labeled like so far right. Like it's crazy. But yeah, I think so many of our listeners will, like myself, will 100% agree. And yeah, it's yeah, that will definitely be a good one. But yeah, thank you so much for your time, Lisa. Before we go, actually, how can people get your book? Where can they get it from?
Sure. My book is available on Amazon and barnesandnoble.com. And if you want to learn a little bit more about me, see more interviews with me, that kind of thing, you can visit my website, which is deprogrammingdemocrats.com. And yeah, thank you
Perfect.
so much for having me, Sunil. This was a great conversation. And I think the more we can have open conversations like this, the harder it will be for the people who are trying to shut down free speech and open dialogue, to do that. So I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you today.
Likewise, Lisa, and we'll put all those links in the description of this episode. So yeah, please do reach out, people. Thank you so much, Lisa.
My pleasure. Thank you.